Over him. It was power. His power. I'm not your weapon, the boy said, his voice low and filled with conviction. I'm not something to be controlled. There was a silence, a heavy pause. The figures in black seemed to stop, as if waiting for something. The boy could feel their eyes on him, calculating, measuring. But they didn't understand. They didn't know what he had realized in those fleeting moments of clarity. He wasn't alone. He wasn't just a tool to be used by anyone. He had the strength inside him to stop this, to break free from their hold. And he wasn't going to let them take that away. Without warning, the boy raised his hands, his fingers trembling, but his resolve unwavering. The moment his hands moved, the air around him shifted, the tension breaking like a thunderclap. The figures in black staggered, thrown back by an unseen force, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. The boy felt a surge of energy deep within him, a power he hadn't known he had. It wasn't just physical strength, it was something deeper, something ancient. Something that made them afraid. Enough! The boy shouted, his voice ringing out across the street. The figures hesitated, but the old man stepped forward, joining the boy. "You've got this," he said, his voice calm but filled with pride. "It's your choice. You have the power to end this." For the first time, the boy understood. It wasn't just about helping others, it was about owning his own strength, his own story. They had tried to manipulate him, to make him believe he was just a pawn. But he was the one who held the power. And now he knew how to use it. He focused on the figures, the dark presence surrounding him, and with a deep breath, he unleashed everything he had. The force rippled outward, sending a shockwave through the air. The figures in black were thrown back, crashing to the ground, unable to stand against the overwhelming force of his will. The power inside him surged, and for a brief, breathtaking moment, he felt like he could do anything, change everything. And then, it was over. The street was silent. The figures lay sprawled on the ground, motionless, their eyes wide in shock. The old man stood by the boy's side, his expression unreadable. But there was no mistaking the pride in his eyes. The boy collapsed to his knees, exhausted, his hands still trembling from the energy he had released. It had been too much, too overwhelming, but he had done it. He had won. The man in black, the leader of the group, lay motionless in front of them, his eyes open but blank. The boy didn't know if he was alive or not. He didn't care. The danger was gone, and he was free. The old man knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "You've saved yourself, and the rest of us." The boy looked up at the old man, his heart still racing, but now with a feeling of relief. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "For now," the old man replied. "But this isn't the end. There will always be people like them, trying to control others. But now you know what you're capable of. You don't have to hide anymore. You can choose how to live your life." The boy nodded, still trying to process everything. The world had changed, but so had he. He was no longer just a boy who shared his lunch with an old man. He was someone who had power, someone who had learned that kindness wasn't weakness, it was strength. And now, he could shape his own future. The old man stood and extended a hand to the boy, helping him to his feet. "Come on. Let's go home. There's still much for you to learn, but you're not alone anymore. You have a purpose. You just need to decide what that purpose is." The boy looked around one last time, the weight of everything that had happened settling in. He had been scared, confused, lost, but now, for the first time, he felt like he understood. He had the power to change his own story. And maybe, just maybe, he could help others change theirs, too. As they walked away from the scene, the boy glanced up at the night sky, feeling a quiet sense of hope that he hadn't felt before. The world wasn't perfect, but he knew he had the strength to face whatever came next. It was his journey now, and he was ready. And somewhere in the distance, just beyond the horizon, something stirred. Another challenge, another chapter, waiting for him to write. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. Melting swirls glistening in the sunlight. "Here, you can have some." The offer caught the boy on the bench completely off guard. He looked up, confused. "What?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible. "He said you can have some," the boy repeated, holding the cone closer. He already had a bite. "It's really good." The boy on the bench stared at him, unsure if this was some kind of joke. Who just offers their ice cream to a stranger? He glanced around, half expecting to see a group of kids hiding nearby, ready to laugh and tease him the moment he reached for it. But there was no one. Just this boy, standing there with an easy smile, offering him a taste of something he couldn't bring himself to get on his own. He can't, the younger boy said finally, shaking his head. His cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and they tried to focus on the ground again. But the other boy didn't leave. Why not? It's just ice cream, he said with a shrug, taking a small step closer. You look like you want some. The boy on the bench tightened his grip on the dollar. His throat felt tight, and he didn't trust himself to speak. Part of him wanted to grab the cone and take the biggest bite he could. Another part of him wanted to run away. He hated this feeling, the mix of longing and shame, like wanting something was a weakness. But the boy with the cone didn't seem to notice his hesitation. Instead, he plopped down on the bench beside him, the cone still in his hand. We can share it, he said casually, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. You can have one side, and I'll have the other. That way, it's fair. The younger boy's stomach growled again, louder this time. He glanced at the cone, then at the boy holding it. There was no teasing in his face, no pity, just a simple kindness that felt almost foreign. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and took a small lick from the side of the cone. The cold sweetness exploded on his tongue, and for a brief moment, he forgot everything else. Good, right? The older boy said, grinning as he took a lick from the other side. Told you. The younger boy nodded, unable to hide the small smile that tugged at his lips. They sat there for a while, passing the cone back and forth, not saying much but sharing something unspoken. It wasn't just ice cream they were sharing, it was a moment of connection, a bridge between two very different lives. But just as the cone was nearly finished, something happened that neither of them expected. A voice called out from across the park, sharp and urgent. The older boy's face fell, and he turned toward the sound. The younger boy followed his gaze and saw a man standing by the playground, waving frantically. The boy with the cone stood up abruptly, brushing his hands on his shorts. "I gotta go," he said quickly, his tone suddenly nervous. He glanced at the younger boy, then at the man by the playground, and for the first time, he looked unsure of himself. "Wait," the younger boy said, standing too. "What's wrong?" The older boy hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nothing," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I have to go." Before the younger boy could say anything else, the older boy took off running, leaving the last bit of the cone melting in the grass. The younger boy watched him go, confusion and worry swirling in his chest. He didn't know what had just happened, but something about the way the other boy ran made his stomach sink. The park felt quieter now, the laughter and chatter fading into the background as the younger boy stood there, alone again. He looked down at the crumpled dollar in his hand, then at the half-eaten cone laying in the dirt. For a moment, he thought about chasing after the boy, about asking him what was wrong. But his legs wouldn't move. All he could do was stand there, watching as the older boy disappeared into the crowd. And just like that, the moment was gone. The boy on the bench sat back down, his heart still racing from the strange encounter. He stared at the melted remains of the ice cream cone on the ground, feeling
a mixture of confusion and guilt. Why had the other boy run off so suddenly? And why did it feel like there was something more to that man calling him than just a parent hurrying their child along? The younger boy clenched the crumpled dollar in his hand, the edges damp from the sweat of his palm. He thought about heading to the ice cream truck himself, but somehow the moment felt wrong now. That brief, unexpected kindness had disappeared just as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a strange emptiness. The park around him felt louder than before, the sounds of children playing and parents chatting blending into a distant hum. He sat still, his mind wandering. He thought about the other boy's smile, the way he had shared the cone without hesitation. It wasn't something the younger boy was used to. Kindness like that didn't happen often in his world. People usually had their own problems to deal with, and there wasn't much room left to worry about anyone else. As the afternoon wore on, the park slowly began to clear out. Parents called their kids back to pack up picnic blankets, and the ice cream truck played its familiar tune one last time before rumbling away down the street. The boy on the bench stayed put, his feet swinging slightly as he watched the world around him shift and change. A sudden rustling behind him made him jump. He turned quickly to see an older woman walking past, her small dog sniffing at the ground near the bench. She smiled politely, giving him a nod before continuing down the path. The boy let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and looked back toward the playground. It was almost empty now, but his eyes lingered on the spot where the other boy had disappeared. The memory of the man's voice calling out echoed in his head. There was something about the tone, it hadn't sounded like a simple time to go kind of call. It was sharp, almost panicked. The boy tried to shake the thought from his mind, but it clung to him like a shadow. He didn't know why he cared so much. It wasn't like he knew the other boy. They were strangers, just two kids who happened to cross paths for a few minutes. And yet, it felt like something important had happened, something he couldn't quite explain. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. The boy finally stood, his legs stiff from sitting so long. He stuffed the dollar into his pocket and started walking toward the street. His stomach growled again, and he thought briefly about stopping by a corner store for something cheap to eat, but he decided against it. The thought of going home empty-handed wasn't appealing, but it wasn't unusual either. Home was only a few blocks away, a small apartment on the edge of the neighborhood. The walk was quiet, the streets mostly empty except for the occasional car passing by. He kicked at a loose pebble as he walked, his thoughts still tangled up in the events of the day. He tried to push them aside, focusing instead on the familiar cracks in the sidewalk and the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stillness. By the time he reached the apartment building, the sky had turned a deep orange, and the first stars were beginning to appear. He climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor, pulling the door open with a loud groan. The hallway smelled faintly of fried food and cleaning supplies, and the dim light flickered overhead as he made his way to his door. Inside, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. His mom usually worked late shifts, so it wasn't unusual for her to be gone when he got home. Still, the emptiness felt heavier today. He set the dollar down on the kitchen counter and grabbed a glass of water, the cool liquid soothing his dry throat. The fridge hummed softly, its near-empty shelves a reminder of the tight budget they were always on. He closed it quickly, not wanting to linger on what wasn't there. The boy shuffled into the small living room, collapsing onto the threadbare couch. He stared at the ceiling, his mind drifting back to the park. What was that other boy's life like? He had seemed so carefree, so full of energy. But then there had been that moment when everything had changed, and he'd run off like something was chasing him. The younger boy wondered if he'd ever see him again, but the thought seemed unlikely. The city was too big for that. As the night wore on, the boy eventually drifted off to sleep, the faint sounds of traffic outside lulling him into uneasy dreams. The next morning, he woke to the sound of keys jingling in the lock. He sat up quickly as the door opened, and his mom stepped in, looking exhausted but smiling when she saw him. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, setting her bag down on the counter. "Did you eat anything last night?" He shook his head, not wanting to explain the events at the park. "I wasn't hungry," he lied. His mom frowned but didn't press him. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the small table, her shoulders sagging as she sipped the steaming liquid. "I'll grab some groceries later," she said, more to herself than to him. "Just need to make it through this week." The boy nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. He wished he could do more to help, but there wasn't much a kid his age could do. The dollar on the counter caught his eye, and he quickly looked away, not wanting to think about how small it seemed in the grand scheme of things. Later that afternoon, the boy found himself wandering back toward the park. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't like he expected to see the other boy again. But something about the place felt different now, like it held a piece of the puzzle he couldn't figure out. The park was busier today, filled with families enjoying the weekend. The ice cream truck was back, its cheerful tune drawing a crowd of kids waving coins and bills. The boy lingered near the bench where he'd sat the day before, watching the familiar scene play out. That's when he saw him. The older boy was back, standing near the swings with a small group of kids. He looked the same as before: bright red shirt, clean sneakers, and that same easy smile. But there was something different now, something harder to see. The younger boy couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was there in the way the older boy glanced around, his eyes darting nervously like he was expecting something or someone. The younger boy hesitated, unsure if he should approach. Part of him wanted to go over, to ask what had happened the day before. But another part of him was afraid. What if the older boy didn't remember him? Or worse, what if he didn't want to talk? Before he could decide, the man from the day before appeared. He was standing by the playground again, his posture tense as he scanned the crowd. The younger boy recognized him immediately: the sharp voice, the frantic gestures. The older boy saw him too, and his expression changed in an instant. The easy smile disappeared, replaced by something closer to fear. The younger boy watched as the older boy turned away, his movements quick and deliberate. He started walking toward the far side of the park, away from the man, his steps almost frantic. The younger boy's heart raced as he realized what was happening. Without thinking, he followed. The older boy moved fast, weaving through the crowd with a practiced ease. The younger boy struggled to keep up, his smaller legs working overtime to close the distance. He didn't know why he was following, only that he couldn't just let the older boy disappear again without understanding what was going on. The chase led them out of the park and onto a quieter street lined with trees and old houses. The older boy finally slowed, glancing over his shoulder to make sure he wasn't being followed. When his eyes landed on the younger boy, he froze. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice a mix of surprise and frustration. The younger boy stopped a few feet away, suddenly feeling foolish. He shrugged, struggling to find the right words. "I just wanted to see if you were okay." The older boy stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to the younger boy's surprise, he let out a small laugh, not a happy one, but the kind of laugh you make when you don't know what else to do. "Why would you care?" the older boy asked, shaking his head. "You don't even know me." "I don't know," the younger boy admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw you run off yesterday and I thought maybe something was wrong." The older boy looked away, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he wasn't going to say anything. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping as if he were carrying a weight too heavy for someone his age. "It's complicated," he said finally, his voice low. "You wouldn't understand." "Maybe I would," the younger boy said, surprising even himself with the determination in his voice. "You can tell me." "I won't tell anyone else." The older boy hesitated, his eyes searching the younger boy's face as if trying to decide whether or not to trust him. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely audible as he said, "Okay, but not here." He glanced around nervously before motioning for the younger boy to follow. The older boy led the younger boy down a narrow alleyway lined with old fences and overgrown bushes. The air felt heavier here, quieter, with only the distant hum of traffic breaking the silence. The older boy kept glancing over his shoulder, his movements tense, like he was expecting someone to appear at any moment. The younger boy followed closely, his heart pounding harder with every step. Finally, they stopped near the back of an abandoned building, its walls covered in faded graffiti. The older boy leaned against the wall, catching his breath, his face pale and drawn. He didn't speak right away, and the younger boy didn't push him. Instead, he waited, his small frame still, sensing that whatever the older boy was about to say wasn't easy for him. "I don't even know where to start," the older boy said after a long pause. His voice was shaky, like he was forcing the words out. I shouldn't even be telling you this." The younger boy tilted his head, his eyes wide with curiosity and concern. "You can tell me. I won't say anything to anyone. I promise." The older boy looked at him for a long moment, his eyes scanning the younger boy's face as if searching for any sign of doubt. Then, He took a deep breath and began to speak, his words tumbling out quickly, like he was afraid he might lose his nerve. That man, the one who was calling me yesterday? He's not my dad, the older boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. He's someone who's been following me. For weeks now. The younger boy's eyes widened, a chill running down his spine. Why is he following you? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. The older boy shook his head, his jaw tightening. I don't know. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. I'd see him at the park, or on the bus, or even near my school. But then I realized. It wasn't random. He always seemed to be where I was, always watching me. The younger boy felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Did you tell anyone? Like your parents or a teacher? The older boy hesitated, his expression growing darker. I can't, he said quietly. It's just me and my little sister at home. If I tell anyone, they might come and take us away. And I can't let that happen. The younger boy's heart ached at the words. He couldn't imagine what it must be like to carry something so heavy alone. But what does he want? He asked, his voice barely audible. I don't know, the older boy admitted, his eyes darting toward the alley's entrance. But yesterday, when he saw me talking to you, it was different. He looked angry. Like I'd done something wrong just by being near you. The younger boy swallowed hard, his mind racing. He thought back to the man's sharp voice, the way he had called out with so much urgency. It hadn't made sense then, but now it felt even more unsettling. Why would he care if we were talking? The younger boy asked, more to himself than to the older boy. I don't know, the older boy said again, his voice growing more frustrated. But I'm scared. I can't keep running from him forever. The younger boy wanted to say something, anything to make the older boy feel better. But before he could speak, a sudden noise cut through the air. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps echoing in the alley. The older boy's eyes widened, his body tensing like a coiled spring. He grabbed the younger boy's arm and pulled him behind a nearby dumpster, pressing a finger to his lips to signal for silence. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just a few feet away. The younger boy's heart pounded in his chest, so loud he was sure whoever was out there could hear it. He held his breath, his small body trembling as he tried to stay perfectly still. The older boy peeked around the edge of the dumpster, his face pale as he turned back to the younger boy. It's him, he mouthed, his lips barely moving. The younger boy felt a surge of fear, his hands gripping the edge of the dumpster as he fought the urge to run. He wanted to look, to see the man for himself, but he was too afraid. Instead, he stayed crouched beside the older boy, his mind racing with questions and panic. The man's voice broke the silence, low and deliberate. I know you're here, he called out, his tone calm but menacing. You can't keep hiding from me. Sooner or later, you're going to have to come out. The younger boy clenched his fists, his breath coming in short, shaky bursts. He glanced at the older boy, who was gripping the edge of the dumpster so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Either of them moved. The man's footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate as he began to walk through the alley. The sound echoed off the walls, each step feeling like a countdown. The boys stayed frozen in place, their small hiding spot feeling smaller by the second. Then, the man's voice came again, closer this time. You think you're safe because you've got someone with you now? He said, a faint hint of amusement in his tone. It doesn't change anything. I'll find you. And when I do, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The younger boy felt a wave of cold fear wash over him. He wanted to ask the older boy what they should do, but he didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps stopped again, just a few feet away. The younger boy could feel his heart pounding in his ears, his body shaking with adrenaline and terror. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to be invisible, to disappear completely. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound of footsteps began to fade. The man was walking away, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was giving them one last chance to reveal themselves. The boys stayed hidden, neither daring to move until the sound of the footsteps disappeared completely. When the alley was finally silent again, the older boy let out a shaky breath, his body slumping against the dumpster. The younger boy looked at him, his wide eyes filled with questions he didn't know how to ask. "We can't stay here," the older boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He'll come back. He always does." The younger boy nodded, his fear giving way to a growing sense of determination. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let the older boy face this alone. "Where can we go?" the younger boy asked, his voice steady despite the fear still lingering in his chest. The older boy hesitated, glancing around the alley as if searching for an answer. "There's a place," he said finally. "It's not far from here. But we have to move fast." The younger boy didn't ask any more questions. He simply nodded, his small frame brimming with quiet resolve. Together, the two boys slipped out of the alley and into the streets, their footsteps quick and purposeful as they disappeared into the fading light. The boys ran through the dimly lit streets, their shadows stretching long and distorted under the flickering streetlights. The older boy led the way, his pace urgent but careful, his eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of the man. The younger boy followed close behind, his breath coming in quick gasps as he tried to keep up. Neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with tension and unspoken fears. After a few blocks, they turned down a quieter street, the buzz of the city fading into a faint hum in the distance. The older boy finally slowed, motioning for the younger boy to follow him behind a cluster of tall bushes near an old park. They crouched there, catching their breath, the sound of their ragged breathing mingling with the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. "We're almost there," the older boy said, his voice low but steady. "It's just past the park. There's an old shed no one uses anymore. We can hide there for a while." The younger boy nodded, his legs trembling from both the running and the lingering fear. Do you think he's still following us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The older boy hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced back the way they had come. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we can't take any chances. We have to keep moving." Just as he was about to stand, a faint sound reached their ears, a distant but unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. Both boys froze, their eyes locking in shared alarm. The sound was faint, but it was getting closer, each step echoing in the still night like a warning. The younger boy's heart raced as he gripped the edge of the bush, his knuckles turning white. "He's here," he whispered, his voice trembling. The older boy didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the path behind them, his body tense and ready to bolt at any moment. But before either of them could move, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, out of the corner of his eye, the younger boy caught a flicker of movement in the shadows. He turned his head, his breath catching in his throat as he spotted a figure standing at the edge of the park. It was too far away to make out any details, but the way the figure stood still and deliberate sent a chill down his spine. The older boy saw it too. He grabbed the younger boy's arm, his grip firm but not harsh. "We can't stay here," he whispered urgently. "Come on." They moved quickly but quietly, staying low as they made their way through the park. The younger boy's heart pounded in his chest, every rustle of leaves and creak of branches making him jump. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, half expecting to see the figure right behind them, but the shadows remained empty. When they finally reached the old shed, it was darker than the younger boy had imagined. The wooden walls were weathered and cracked, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. The older boy pushed the door open and stepped inside, pulling the younger boy with him before carefully closing it behind them. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and dust. Moonlight streamed in through the gaps in the walls, casting thin beams of light across the floor. The older boy leaned against the wall, his shoulders sagging as he let out a shaky breath. "We should be safe here," he said, his voice barely audible. The younger boy nodded, though he didn't feel safe at all. His eyes darted around the small space, his mind racing with everything that had happened. He wanted to ask the older boy what they should do next, but before he could speak, a new sound broke the silence, a faint but distinct buzzing. The older boy stiffened, his hand immediately going to his pocket. He pulled out his phone, his face pale as he stared at the screen. The younger boy craned his neck to see, his stomach dropping when he saw the caller ID. It was the man. The phone buzzed again, the sound loud and jarring in the quiet shed. The older boy's hands shook as he declined the call, his breath coming in short bursts. But the moment the buzzing stopped, it started again, the screen lighting up with the man's name. "He knows we're here," the younger boy whispered, his voice barely audible. The older boy didn't respond. Instead, he turned the phone off and shoved it back into his pocket, his jaw clenched. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice tight with fear and frustration. "He's not going to stop until he finds us." Before they could make a plan, a sudden noise outside the shed made them both freeze. It wasn't footsteps this time, it was the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground, accompanied by a low, guttural hum. The younger boy's blood turned cold as he exchanged a panicked glance with the older boy. "What is that?" the younger boy whispered, his voice shaking. The older boy didn't answer. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, and motioned for the younger boy to move toward the back of the shed. They crouched low, their breaths shallow as they listened to the strange noise grow louder. Then, without warning, the shed door creaked open, the sound echoing in the confined space. The younger boy's heart felt like it might burst out of his chest as he clutched the older boy's arm, his small body trembling with fear. A beam of light swept across the shed, illuminating the walls and floor in quick, jerky movements. "Come out," a deep voice called, sending a shiver down the younger boy's spine. "I know you're in here. There's no use hiding." The boys stayed perfectly still, their bodies pressed against the wall as the light moved closer. The younger boy's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs felt like they were glued to the floor. He could feel the older boy's grip tighten on his arm, a silent reassurance that they were in this together. The light stopped just a few feet away, hovering over a pile of old tools in the corner. For a moment, the only sound was the man's slow, deliberate breathing. Then, with a sudden movement, the light swung toward the back of the shed, landing directly on the boys. The younger boy's breath caught in his throat as the man stepped forward, his face partially obscured by the harsh glare of the flashlight. There was something about the way he looked at them, cold and calculating, that made the younger boy's stomach churn. "You've been making this much harder than it needs to be," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "But it ends now." The boys didn't move, their eyes wide with fear as the man took another step closer. The older boy's hand tightened around something on the ground, a broken piece of wood, and he raised it slightly, ready to defend them if it came to that. But before the man could take another step, a sudden noise outside the shed made him pause. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a high-pitched wail that sent a chill down the younger boy's spine. The man turned his head toward the door, his expression darkening as the noise grew closer. The boys exchanged a quick, confused glance, their fear momentarily overshadowed by curiosity. Whatever was happening outside, it was enough to make the man hesitate, his hand hovering over the flashlight as he listened intently. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the wailing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, every second feeling heavier than the last. The man's gaze snapped back to the boys, his face twisted in anger. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice dripping with menace. And with that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving the boys alone in the darkened shed, their hearts pounding with a mix of relief and lingering fear. The younger boy turned to the older boy, his voice barely above a whisper. What was that? What just happened? The older boy didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the door, his mind racing as he tried to process everything. I don't know, he said finally, his voice tinged with both fear and determination. But whatever it was, it might have just saved us. The boys sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, their breaths shallow as they listened to the night around them. The wind rattled the broken boards of the shed, but otherwise, everything had gone eerily still. The older boy clutched a piece of wood in his hands, his knuckles white as he stared at the door, half expecting the man to burst back in at any moment. The younger boy huddled beside him, his small frame trembling, though whether it was from the cold or the lingering fear, he couldn't tell. We need to get out of here, the older boy finally whispered, his voice steady but urgent. He's not going to give up. If we stay, he'll come back. The younger boy nodded, though the thought of stepping outside filled him with dread. But what about whatever that noise was? He asked, his voice barely audible. What if it's still out there? The older boy hesitated, his brow furrowing as he considered the question. He didn't have an answer, but he knew they couldn't stay. We'll stick to the shadows, he said finally. We'll move fast and stay quiet. We can't let him trap us here. Reluctantly, the younger boy pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky but willing. The older boy cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. The night was still, the faint glow of the street lights barely illuminating the path ahead. There was no sign of the man or the strange noise, but that only made the silence feel more oppressive. Stay close to me, the older boy said, his voice firm but kind. And no matter what happens, don't stop running. The younger boy swallowed hard and nodded. Together, they slipped out of the shed, the cool night air biting against their skin. They moved quickly but quietly, their footsteps muffled against the dirt path as they made their way back toward the main road. Every shadow seemed to shift and stretch toward them, and every rustle of leaves made their hearts race. But they kept moving, their fear propelling them forward. As they neared the edge of the park, the younger boy glanced over his shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. His breath caught in his throat when he spotted a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the trees. It wasn't the man this time, it was something else, something he couldn't quite make out in the darkness. The figure was tall and thin, its movements slow and deliberate as it stepped closer. Someone's there, he whispered urgently, tugging on the older boy's sleeve. The older boy turned, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the shadowy figure. His grip on the piece of wood tightened, but he didn't stop moving. Just keep going, he said, his voice low but firm. We're almost out. But the figure didn't stay in the distance. As the boys moved faster, it did too, its movements unnaturally smooth and fluid. The younger boy's heart pounded as he stumbled, the older boy catching him just in time to keep him from falling. It's following us, the younger boy cried, his voice breaking. The older boy didn't respond. He grabbed the younger boy's hand and pulled him forward, their pace frantic as they finally reached the main road. The streetlights cast a pale glow over the empty pavement, and for a brief moment, the boys felt a glimmer of hope. But when they looked back, the figure had followed them out of the park, its form now fully illuminated by the light. It wasn't human. The younger boy's eyes widened in terror as he took in the figure's appearance. Its skin was pale and almost translucent, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its eyes glowed faintly, their gaze fixed unblinkingly on the boys. The older boy stepped in front of the younger boy, holding the piece of wood like a weapon, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. Stay behind me, the older boy said, his voice shaking but resolute. The figure tilted its head, as if studying them, before taking a slow, deliberate step forward. The boys backed away, their feet moving instinctively as the figure drew closer. But just as the tension reached its breaking point, a new sound shattered the silence, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from all around them. The figure froze, its glowing eyes darting toward the source of the noise. The boys turned as well, their fear mingling with confusion as they tried to locate the origin of the sound. And then, out of the shadows, a large, dark shape emerged. It was a dog, or at least, it looked like one. Its fur was matted and black as night, and its eyes burned with an intensity that made the boy's skin crawl. The creature bared its teeth, its growl growing louder as it stepped between the boys and the figure. The figure seemed to hesitate, its glowing eyes flickering as it regarded the dog. For a moment, everything was still, the air heavy with tension. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, the figure turned and disappeared back into the shadows, its form melting into the darkness as if it had never been there. The boys stood frozen, their breaths coming in shallow gasps as they stared at the spot where the figure had vanished. The dog turned to look at them, its glowing eyes meeting theirs. For a moment, they were too stunned to move, unsure whether the creature was friend or foe. But then, to their surprise, the dog's expression softened. It let out a low whine and stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The younger boy reached out hesitantly, his hand trembling as he placed it on the dog's head. The creature leaned into the touch, its growl replaced by a soft, almost comforting rumble. The older boy watched in amazement, his grip on the piece of wood loosening as the tension in his body eased. "Where did you come from?" the younger boy whispered, his voice filled with awe and gratitude. The dog didn't answer, of course, but there was something in its eyes, something almost intelligent, that made the boys feel safe for the first time all night. The older boy knelt beside it, his hand joining the younger boy's as they both petted the creature. It was warm and solid, a reassuring presence in the otherwise terrifying night. But their relief was short-lived. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The boys looked at each other, their fear returning as they realized the man was still out there. The dog's ears perked up, its body tensing as it turned toward the sound. Without warning, it let out a deep, resonant bark that seemed to shake the very air around them. The footsteps faltered, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the sound of hurried retreat filled the night as the man fled, his heavy steps fading into the distance. The boys sagged with relief, their fear finally giving way to exhaustion. The dog turned back to them, its eyes soft and almost gentle. It nudged the younger boy's hand with its nose, as if to reassure him, before stepping back into the shadows. The boys watched as it disappeared, its form melting into the darkness just as the strange figure had. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, the younger boy broke the silence. "Do you think it'll come back?" he asked, his voice trembling. The older boy placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression calm despite the chaos of the night. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it was on our side." The boys walked home together, the events of the night replaying in their minds. They didn't know who or what the dog had been, but they knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't have made it without it. And as they stepped into the safety of their home, they couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of the mysterious creature. The boys didn't sleep much that night. They stayed in the living room, huddled under a shared blanket, their faces pale and minds still racing. Every creak of the house made them flinch, every gust of wind outside sent their imaginations spiraling. The older boy sat with his back against the wall, his arms crossed as if trying to guard them both from the unknown. The younger boy, still shaken, stared at the faint glow of the television they'd left on, the muffled voices from the late-night programs filling the otherwise silent room. Neither spoke much. What could they say? They both knew what they'd seen wasn't normal, and no explanation could make it feel less real. The man, the figure in the park, and the strange dog, they all lingered in the air like a half-finished puzzle, pieces scattered but never fully coming together. And yet, amidst the fear, there was something comforting about being home. The door was locked, the lights were on, and for now, they were safe. When the first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains, the older boy finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "It's morning," he said softly, his voice rough from exhaustion. The younger boy looked at him, his eyes red-rimmed but alert. Do you think it's over? He asked hesitantly. The older boy hesitated before nodding. I think so, he replied, though his tone carried a hint of uncertainty. We made it back. That has to mean something. The younger boy didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Instead, he let his head fall against the back of the couch, his eyelids growing heavy now that the warmth of the morning made the night feel a little less terrifying. By midday, the boys were finally brave enough to venture outside again, though they stuck close to the house. The park, with its shadows and unanswered mysteries, was a distant thought they weren't ready to revisit. Instead, they sat on the front steps, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. Kids rode their bikes up and down the street, an older couple walked their dog, and the mailman made his usual rounds. It all felt so normal, almost as if the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. But the truth was, either boy could shake the feeling that something had changed. The world didn't seem as simple as it had just 24 hours ago. The older boy glanced at his younger companion, who was absently tracing patterns on the pavement with a stick. You okay? He asked, his tone gentle. The younger boy nodded slowly but didn't meet his gaze. I keep thinking about that dog, he admitted after a long pause. Why did it help us? Where did it go? The older boy didn't have an answer, though he'd been wondering the same thing. The memory of the dog's glowing eyes, its powerful bark that sent their pursuer running, and the way it had melted into the shadows like it had always belonged there, it all felt surreal. Maybe it just knew we needed help, he offered finally. Sometimes, things happen for a reason. The younger boy seemed to consider this, his expression thoughtful. Do you think it was real? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The older boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down the street, his eyes scanning the quiet neighborhood. I think real doesn't always mean what we think it does, he said carefully. Maybe it wasn't just a dog, but whatever it was there when we needed it. And that's what matters. The younger boy nodded, though his gaze remained distant. He wanted to believe it was that simple, but part of him couldn't help but wonder if the dog and everything else they'd seen was just the beginning of something bigger. Over the next few days, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could. The boys went back to their usual routines, though they avoided the park altogether. Their friends teased them about their sudden disinterest in hanging out at their usual spot, but neither of them offered an explanation. How could they? They weren't even sure they understood it themselves. At night, though, the memories crept back in. The sound of footsteps in the dark, the shadowy figure with glowing eyes, the man's twisted smile, it all played on a loop in their minds. But more than anything, they thought about the dog. The way it had appeared out of nowhere, its fierce presence driving away both man and monster, and the quiet intelligence in its gaze that made them feel, if only for a moment, that they weren't alone. It was a week later when the younger boy spotted it again. He had been walking home from the store, the plastic bag in his hand swinging gently as he strolled down the sidewalk. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement, and the air was warm and still. He wasn't thinking about the dog or the park, or the man, or anything from that night. He was just eager to get home before it got dark. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The same black, matted fur. The same glowing eyes. It was standing at the edge of a nearby alley, its form partially hidden by the shadows. For a moment he froze, his breath catching in his throat. The dog didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching him. Hey, he said softly, his voice trembling but not unkind. He took a tentative step forward, his heart pounding. It's you, isn't it? You're the one who helped us. The dog tilted its head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, slowly, it stepped out of the shadows. In the daylight, it looked a little less otherworldly, but no less imposing. Its eyes, though still intense, held a warmth that eased the boy's fear. Where did you go? The boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did you leave? The dog didn't answer, of course, but it took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The boy crouched down, his hand outstretched. For a moment, they stayed like that, man and beast, either moving, as if the world around them had paused. Then, with a soft huff, the dog closed the distance between them. It pressed its nose into the boy's hand, its fur rough but warm against his skin. The boy let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through him. "You're real," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "You're really real." The dog stayed for only a moment longer before pulling away. It looked at him one last time, its gaze steady and almost knowing, before turning and disappearing down the alley. The boy stood there, staring after it, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to follow, but something told him he shouldn't. The dog had come back, if only for a moment, and that was enough. When he told the older boy what had happened, the reaction was a mix of disbelief and awe. "You actually saw it again?" the older boy asked, his voice tinged with amazement. "And it let you touch it?" The younger boy nodded, his eyes shining. "It was just like before. Like it knew me. Like it knew us." The older boy didn't say anything for a long time. He was trying to process it all, trying to make sense of something that didn't seem to have an explanation. But in the end, he realized it didn't matter. The dog, whatever it was, had been there when they needed it most. And maybe that was all they needed to know. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of that night began to fade, though it never disappeared completely. The boys grew older, their lives taking them in different directions, but they never forgot the dog or the strange events that had brought them closer than ever. It became a story they shared only with each other, a reminder of a night that had changed them in ways they couldn't fully explain. And though they never saw the dog again, they liked to believe it was still out there, watching over someone else, waiting for the moment when it would be needed once more. It wasn't just a dog, it was something more. Something that reminded them, even in the darkest of nights, that they were never truly alone.